For over 3,000 years of recorded history, the study of astrology has been an interesting panoply of ideas. And people from the earliest pharaohs of Egypt to kings and queens and emperors to modern days, even back to Napoleon and to Adolf Hitler and even current presidents have had the influence of astrology impact their lives. And Joan Quigley, what's an astrologer?
Oh,
What's an astrologer, Joan Quigley?
oh, an astrologer is someone who plots the meaning of the map of the heavens that represents when a person or an idea or a country or a beginning is born.
One of the
It's a map of the heavens for the time and place of birth.
So let me, and maybe, you've been doing this for about, what, 45 years?
Close to that. I mean, a little bit more, but
One of the things that I always wondered what you might think about is, why do you think that astrology has endured through all of these millennia?
because it's truth. And I think now I have always known that astrology was scientific. My first recollection of astrology when I was about 15 years old, my mother went to an astrologer for an afternoon's entertainment, and she came home quite convinced that it was scientific. And she had all our horoscopes cast up, and she bought a lot of astrology books, and I read every last one of them. And when I came home from college, I said to my father, I want to be an astrologer. Well, if I had said I wanted to be a refugee from a gypsy tea room, he couldn't have been more alarmed. And he said, but he was a reasonable man, and he was indulgent with his daughters. And he said, you may study astrology if you like, Joan, but don't tell my friends or your friends.
One of the things that has always been, I guess, cast the pale over astrology is the fact that they called it a pseudoscience.
Oh, but it isn't a pseudoscience, it's quite scientific. According to Einstein's theory, all matter is frozen energy, and that energy is suffused with light. And the light within us responds to the light without, either conversely or directly. Recently in Switzerland there was a study, and they took a light beam and cut it in half, and they put each half down a chute that went about 10 kilometers apart, and when they reached their destination they released the light beam, and they found that they both went in the same direction. And so light beams have a direction that they go in, and they affect us. I mean, I've seen this, it's almost physical. When Saturn goes overhead, you can take the most beautiful young woman or the handsomest young man, and if it's squaring their moon or their Venus, they think they look in the mirror and they think they look ugly. I've never seen it to fail.
Let me be your devil's advocate here, because there's lots of people out there in the world that would say, oh, this is nothing more than, a little psychobabble, that they throw a lot of words out there, but they don't understand astrology. For those people that think that these are, because when you say sun, square, moon, or things like that, these people don't understand what that means. Well,
I apologize for using astrological terms because I can't express it otherwise. There is a definite effect of light on human beings, and I think Einstein recognized it, and a lot of physicists have recognized it. It just hasn't been really proved yet, but I can catch a glimpse of it now from all the things I've observed. I can tell you to the day when things will happen. It's absolutely accurate, and I have a system now that is unbelievable. Nothing will ever be totally accurate, but you see,
well, let's follow that up. You just said something very important. You said nothing will be completely accurate. Why would you say something like that?
Well, what I do is very accurate. I mean, I can be accurate to the minute almost sometimes. Uh, but what I've done, I've evolved a system that's very computer friendly. I have always done very outstanding people. They just vibrate toward me, and uh, people who've accomplished a lot or are very important in some way. However, about 10 years ago, I started dipping into the mass market. You wanted, the subject of this was the mass market astrology.
Well,
I started
the subject, yeah.
dipping into the kind of people that never came to me until I became very well known. And then all kinds of people were calling me, and I couldn't deal with this. I couldn't satisfy them all. And if I put them in the hands of other astrologers, that they made terrible mistakes and cost these people a lot of agony and hardship. And so I felt that there must be some way that I could give what I knew to the public at large. And when they say the mass market for astrology, there is no such thing, because of all the people in the mass market are individuals. And I have sort of invented or created a system using computer where if I did 1,000,000 horoscopes, there would be 1,000,000 different answers to the questions.
All right, let's step back just a bit here. We might be getting just a tad ahead of ourselves on this. Where I really want to go is understanding one important issue here, and that is there are a lot of people that are very religious in character, and that's they can be from any religious background for any matter. Astrology has always been across the globe. It's been in India, it's been in China, it's been
South America,
in Russia, it's been everywhere.
Everywhere.
Right, and still religion, traditional religion still survives. But it seems that sometimes people think that astrology is what they call New Age, Babel, and they feel it is the false prophet. Now, how would you respond to that kind of criticism?
Well, I think we're going into the Aquarian age, and Aquarius is ruled by the planet Uranus, which is the astrologer's planet. I think in this age, which will be 2,000 years long, astrology will really come into its own, and its scientific merit will be appreciated.
So you think that you think that you just I guess what you've done is you just put a fork in the ground and say it just works and it's based on mathematics, not based on.
It's based on mathematics and science. It's based on the science of astronomy and mathematics.
Well, let me ask you this then: why could, let's say, 4 or 5 different astrologers do one person's chart and come up with 4 or 5 different answers? How is that possible?
Because 3 or 4 of them are wrong.
And that causes great confusion, mind you, for those out there that might be interested in.
Economists are the same. Economists are the same, and some doctors think one thing and some think another. I don't think you'll find any discipline that's modern or ancient or anything where people totally agree.
Right.
But I think there's such an interest in astrology now. Every magazine, every newspaper, but all they are given is sun sign stuff, and I just. Astrology is much more complex than that. And what I'm trying to do, and I'm succeeding, is I just need a little more funding before I finish the final stage of development, put this out in the market. It is astrology, it will customize the mass market. In other words, it will personalize what comes to you. You'll have your real horoscope and not just be. I mean, how can 1/12 of the world's population be experiencing the same thing on a given day? Those
we understand that.
Are absurd. But they do show an interest in astrology.
Let me ask you this: our parents have always given us their sage advice. They always give their children sage advice. They say you should not do this and you should do that, and a lot of times children disregard what their parents say or authority figures say to them, and they go their own way. Let's take that step with astrology one step and say that you make a prediction for someone. How do you know that they'll follow through with it?
Well, sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. I think the reason I said that astrology may not be absolutely exact is this, or appear to be not absolutely exact, is this. There are certain configurations of the planets and predictions can be made that are absolutely certain. There's nothing you can do to change them. They're absolute fate. And then there's a part of astrology where free will operates. And in that part of astrology, you can make good things better or avoid difficulties.
One of the things I've got to interrupt you. I've got to interrupt you on that point because why is it after what 3,000 years of recorded astrological study, well, no one can explain the difference to most people about their free will on one hand and the fated issues on the other. Can you help us out with that?
Well, yes, but it would be very technical and nobody would understand it.
Well, give it a try. Let's follow down that road and see what.
No, I really don't want to answer that question right now.
All right.
What I want to do is put out my form of astrology, and people will see that for themselves.
All right. So, would you say that there are now, as you said, you started this study as a young girl, and you did that. Where did you grow up? Let's find that out.
Well, I grew up in San Francisco.
So
my life really began when my mother went, when I was 15, to the astrologer for an afternoon's entertainment.
And that just captures you forever, doesn't it?
It captured me forever, and I couldn't wait to go to this lady and ask her to teach me astrology. And she said, "Well, I hate the mathematics. If you do the mathematics on your own, I will teach you." And of course, the math was so simple for me. I'd had a lot of advanced math in college, and so I was able to do that.
What was your course of study at what university did you go?
I went to Vassar.
And now tell us, what did you study there?
I studied art history. I studied economics. I studied geology. I studied, oh my goodness, I had a fabulous course in Shakespeare. Absolutely fabulous.
Well, you had an extremely broad,
I had a liberal arts education.
I would
and that
say.
was very good for what I did, but the art history was excellent because it taught me to recognize symbols and visual things.
Now, did you study
my mind in that way?
Did you study the metaphysics part of astrology as well? Did you study the Hinduism and all of the different religions and all the ancient studies?
I think the subject of religion is fascinating, and people who say that the Bible's against religion, well, the Bible is against the sort of pop astrology people, but there's a lot of very interesting things in the Bible. I mean, just the star that the wise men followed, they were obviously astrologers. And I have a friend who's a Catholic, and he said that in the Catholic material for Christmas, they call the wise men of the King James Version the astrologers. And then, of course, there's a famous passage, "There is a time for all things." And then there is the 12 signs in the early part of the Bible, which are the sons of the 12 sons of Benjamin or someone like that. I can't remember anymore, but they all describe the various signs of the zodiac, actually.
Well, you're a very bright lady, and seemingly with the education that you had and your intelligence, you've been doing astrology for a number of years. That it must work. Do you use it on a daily basis?
Yes, it does. It works. It works for everyone. It's a very helpful thing for people. It teaches people not to go down blind alleys. I remember once I had a young girl come to me. Maybe she was 30, 35, and she said to me, she said, "Well, what do you see in my horoscope?" And I said, "Well, I see that you'll never marry happily, and that your boss will never promote you, even though you're a good worker." And she said, "Oh, that's a load off my shoulders." And I said, why do you say that? She said, because it's true. And she said, if someone like you, who's never met me, can say this, it just takes away all the aggravation I've had with my mother and sister who were trying to push me into one unsuitable marriage after another. So she said, well, you've told me what I can't do, now tell me what I can do. So I said, well, I looked at her horoscope and I said, well, I think this year you could make a lot of money speculating. And she trotted off happily. And then the stock market began to fall, and it fell, and it fell, and it fell. And I said to my sister, I feel really dreadful about that girl. I've got to call her up and offer to pay for her losses. Ruth said, well, you saw it. Honestly, you really saw it? And I said, yes. So she said, well, wait, she'll come back. So she came back the following year. She bounced in happily. She'd gotten herself a broker who specialized in the over-the-counter market, and while the rest of the market was going south, he managed to make her, 4 times on her money, and she was able to retire. And she said to me, shall I go up to Oregon where my mother and sister live? And I said, or go to Texas where I have 4 good friends. I said, go to Texas. Anyway, I've never heard from her again.
Let me ask you this. How many years of astrological self-teaching did you take from teachers? Did you learn it on your own, or how did you learn? How did you learn what you do?
Well, I learned the basics from Mrs. Pearson, who was a Scottish lady who studied astrology around the time they excavated Tutankhamun's tomb in London. And then she said, you will always work and study alone. When she was dying, she told me that. And I really have mostly. Mildred Schuler in the Middle West did a certain amount of mundane astrology, and I had learned some of the principles of mundane astrology.
What is mundane astrology for those that don't know?
Mundane astrology is what's happening to the world. For instance, take the 15th and the 20th century. In the 15th century, in both these centuries, Neptune, Uranus, and Pluto, which went through the sign of Scorpio, which is the sign of science and discovery, sex and death. And look what happened. The 15th century, Columbus discovered America. We put a man on the moon. In the 15th century, the printing press was invented. We've had the information revolution. And in the 15th century, syphilis began to spread throughout Europe, and we've had AIDS. So there's that's sort of what mundane astrology is all about. And I have done my own research because I have ephemerides that go back a great many centuries.
Well, tell us what an ephemeris is, because otherwise...
An ephemeris is a book of the daily positions of the sun, moon, and planets.
And this would go back many centuries, so you could actually know when those planets were, where their location was.
It's where the major look. The reason people like Nostradamus are famous, he's terribly famous, but he wasn't dealing with the full deck, because he was born in the 16th century and he practiced astrology in the 16th century, and no one knew about Neptune, Uranus, or Pluto. Now, Uranus was discovered at the end of the 18th century, Neptune in the middle of the 19th, and Pluto in 1930. And astrologers before that time didn't know. I took the time that Napoleon began Waterloo. And according to that time, Neptune was on an angle of the chart, which meant that everything was fuzzy and people would be where they weren't supposed to be, and that's exactly what happened with Waterloo. Then this friend of mine who was an historian had a painter. They were doing a book about a painter, and the only thing they knew about him was what his horoscope was left. He was in maybe the middle of the 19th century. And I put Neptune in the little horoscope that he left, and it was on the midheaven. I said, this man was just a constant scandal. He was a living and breathing scandal. they laughed and they said, well, you know, the only thing we know about him is that he got mixed up with other people's wives when he'd paint in a certain location, and he would get tarred and feathered and sent out of town as a result.
Let's talk about some tarred and feathered people that have followed astrology, and one of them was, of course, well-known Adolf Hitler. And if now the naysayers again, and I'm just being the devil's advocate here, I hope you know, because there's part of the public that's going to say this. They're going to say, well, if astrology works so well, how in the world could Adolf Hitler not, if he followed his astrologers, fail so miserably?
Well, I read a book about that, and he didn't really have, one of his henchmen was dealing in a loose fashion with an astrologer, and they say he had a lot of them advising him. Well, some astrologers are better than others. They may not have been very good, but the astrology wasn't as intensive as people said. That's almost a myth.
Interesting, because most people would always say that that was one of the downfalls.
You know, Churchill also used astrology. He had an astrologer named Wall, and he wanted to combat the fact that Hitler's astrologers were saying that Hitler would win. And Churchill sent this man over to the United States to convince people that Hitler's astrologers were wrong. It was sort of a publicity event.
Unbelievable. Well, listen, one of the things that in astrology that people's eyes glaze over on, you know, you're throwing so many different terms and unfamiliar ground to them that takes many years really to understand. Are you asking people that, well, let's say that had never had their astrology chart done, to have their chart done and then to believe exactly what is said?
I think that's very bad. You know, if the astrologer is not terribly good, I mean, for instance, a typical internet astrologer says nothing. They're just canned paragraphs, and it's pretty. As I was saying to you before, that these people are simply refugees from retail who know that astrology will make a lot of money, but they don't know about astrology. One of the most famous ones was asked about the Unabomber's horoscope, and she said he was a nice guy. And then she went on to say that Clinton's Mars was in Aries when it's in Libra. I mean, things like that. They don't really know astrology at all.
Well, how would anyone know then? What would be your advice, not just for yourself now, but for other? Undoubtedly, you believe there's probably some other good astrologers outside of yourself, don't you?
Of course there are.
And how would someone wanting to know more about astrology actually find what you call a knowledgeable and capable astrologer?
I think it's rather difficult, although if they find someone that seems to hit the nail on the head for them enough, I mean, it's just practical experience. They're probably good for them.
All right, let me ask you this. This is one of the big ones in most people's minds that get them a little confused. First of all, everyone is born with a certain chart.
Yes.
And then that chart moves.
Yes.
And then the third part of it is that there are planets that they call transits. And I don't really know, you've got a chart that you start with. This is you when you were born that day.
Yes, but for instance, every mole that's in your body when you're born is there, and it may not come out until you're 60 years old. And so the experiences that are indicated for you may not happen unless you live long enough to experience all of them. But as the life unfolds, there are many very predictable events. However, the way you take these events, the way the astrologer helps you to get through them. I mean, when I have someone who has something that's absolutely fated, I try to get them to take it in the best way if it's negative, and if it's positive, I try to get them to enjoy it to the hilt. But if it's something that could or could not happen, you see, the average person only lives up to maybe 50% of what they're intended to do. And what I try to do is to solve people's problems using astrology, and to give them an indication of what's possible and what isn't possible, and how they can avoid the major difficulties.
So every one of us are born with our own moles, as you say, in our own warts, and those may not come out for many years, but you're able to perhaps mitigate some of these situations that they could face. In other words, on timing, based on the timing of what they choose to do.
Well, it's based on, um, I, I have done something that I never thought was even possible. I can time things using computers, and that's a feat. I mean, after I did some very expert timing for a politician for a while, and after it was all over, people said to me, "Why don't you write a book about timing?" And I thought, nobody's ever written a book about timing because it's just so complex. It's the sum total of what an astrologer knows after 40 or 50 years. And then I thought, well, I was playing around with my computer and I realized that I could do a lot of timing using computer and give that advantage to people so that they did things at the best time.
All right, let me ask you this. This is something that's really more of a psychological question, but I think you know, as a good astrologer, you might be able to have an opinion on it. People go through life with a lot of guilt, guilt from childhood, guilt from adult teen years or adulthood, and when someone is an astrologer, they can kind of see inside of that person, and many people don't want to really face themselves. Does it take an act of faith by that person then to want to find out? In other words, people are afraid to show themselves. And when you go to an astrologer, you're obviously going to have to put yourself out there.
Well, you know, so many things happen when people are young that influence them later in life. And often I can look at a chart. You know, they go to a psychiatrist for 10 years and they still don't know. I can look at a chart and see what happened in a child's life. I had the chart of a young man who was, his son went square to Neptune when he was a year old. And I said to him, when you were a year old, you went to a different location and you were very unhappy and it seemed weird and unreasonable to him. He said, yes, and I remember it, and I was only a year old. And when my website first came out, someone from Lycos called me and said, tell me, I've seen your website, I like it, but tell me anything about myself that's true. And I told him about something that happened when he was 4 years old. He dead silence at the end of the phone. How did you know? And I told him that, you know, I was a competent astrologer. And then he told his boss, and his boss said, I want to know what she says about me.
Let me ask you this. Let's skip a gear here to something that's really important about what you just said. The predictive events in people's lives also scare them. In addition to the fact that they've got their own personal flaws or their personal experiences that were, you know, painful in their life that they're afraid an astrologer might find out about. They're also afraid of what the future may hold at times. And so how do you assail their fears on things that if they were going to go to a truly competent astrologer, how would their fears be soothed, I guess?
Well, for instance, the curious part of it is, if you tell a thief he's a thief, he's very proud of it. You know? I mean, it's something, you can't tell people anything about their character that they don't rather, I don't know, I don't think they're so ashamed of it. They're just delighted that you commented on it. I had a client recently, and I said, you're going to have a terrible day at such and such a time. He called me up. He was just exulting. He said, well, I had the worst day, and he told me what had happened.
Well, you know what you're doing is you're kind of making people afraid because the last
No, he was so excited that it was nothing he'd done himself, but it was in his horoscope. He was thrilled to know that.
But
Some people want to know all the bad things. Other people want to know only the good things.
That's what I was about to say, and I wanted to follow that up.
Some people want to know everything, but
yeah.
I had one girl that said, all I want to know is about my love life, when I'll have dates, and so forth and so forth, and when I'm going to get married. Well, she wasn't going to get married for 4 years, so every year she called me and I told her all these things. And then, she got married, and I never heard from her again.
The fun part of astrology is what to you? What's the most fun thing that you do about your job?
Well, I just love people, and I love helping them and helping them to solve their problems, and I, I love human nature. I can't explain this so much. You know, some people love art, some people love music. I like those too, but I just love people and their idiosyncrasies and what happens to them. And I learned very early in practicing astrology that nothing is so strange that it can't happen. I had this horoscope of a young man. He was about 30 years old. I was doing this in New York under a nom de plume, and this friend of mine would tell people she knew an astrologer, and then they send their birth information to me, and I'd write back what was happening. Anyway, this young man, I saw in his horoscope an explosion, the death of a child, and a divorce. And I thought, this is so weird, and yet it was what I saw, so I wrote it down. Well, he bribed the people at the place where I was staying, and he called me and he said, I know you're Joan Quigley and I want to meet you. And so I went down, and I was a young girl, and he thought I'd be some funny old lady. So he took me out dancing to dinner, and he told me this story. He'd been married to a girl who had a child by a former marriage, and he hunted in the Long Island, and then he'd go into Wall Street. And when he was in Wall Street one day, the child got into one of his hunting guns, which was loaded, accidentally exploded the gun, killed itself, and the mother was so mad that she got a divorce. So there it was, the explosion, the death of a child, and a divorce. And I've never seen anything quite that peculiar.
You know, it's the things that you're able to see. How much do you attribute? Let me step back. I've got to ask you a couple things. You know, you wrote a wonderful, probably the most wonderful book ever written about astrology back in 1969, called Astrology for Adults by Joan Quigley. And it was just a fantastic, and still is, stands on its own as one of the more fantastic definitive works for simple and even more than simple explanations of events from your chart. So let's go to that part. Where did you start to write that book, and how did that come about?
Well, that was the first book I wrote, really. I'd written a book on a teenage astrology the year before, and then I wrote this book based on my experiences and a lot of the people that I'd studied and so forth then. But I have so much more to do now.
No. Wait a minute. We'll get to that point, but I've really got to follow this part up about this.
See, when it was around the time that Linda Goodman's Sun Signs came out.
Right.
And that was a very entertaining book, but it wasn't really astrology.
No.
It was just sun signs.
Exactly.
So I thought, why not write a book about all the planets, not just the sun? And I wrote something about the aspects and so forth, but I have learned so much more since that time. And I have so much more. I've put what I know on computer, so that with this young programmer who's brilliant, and I have put our heads together, and our horoscopes go absolutely in sync. And I have designed various things for the mass market, but I'm not designing for the mass market. I'm designing for all the unique individuals that compose the mass market.
All right. Now listen, you were, I'm just trying to follow a little short chronology here about how success works. And obviously you've had very good share of success in your life. And from that publishing of that book, you went on to publish other books. You became the confidant of some very important people in the world. This didn't all happen in 30 seconds. You know, this happened over a period of time. And I'm just trying to get a grip on how events happened for Joan Quigley in her life, and how she went from being this author of an elemental, I'm going to say, but brilliant, elemental but brilliant astrology book to the next step. How did that all? What happened after you published Astrology for Adults for you personally?
Well, I published astrology for adults, and I went on a book tour across the country with it. And I went to the Phil Donahue show when he was first going in Dayton, Ohio. I had to be helicoptered to the show, and I got there 15 minutes before the show. And he said, well, now this is the first time I've gone into Chicago and Washington and New York and so forth. He just had a little local show. He said, well, we'll discuss the sun signs. I said, oh, no, we won't. I brought my ephemerides and I'll tell people in the audience about their real horoscopes. He said, I'm not going to do it. I said, fine, then we won't do it. I hope you'll have good luck getting someone 15 minutes before the show. So he had to do it. And we went on, and we talked for 20 minutes about astrology, and then he asked the audience, how many people believe in astrology? And then how many people don't? And half of them raised their hands on each question. And then after that, I went through the audience and I told them things about themselves with these books, which I could look up very quickly and tell people basic things about themselves. At the end, he said, how many believe in astrology? And everybody raised their hand except one lady.
That's just because you're so charming, probably. Anyway,
No.
I was going to let's move on from that to something that how did you become the astrologer to celebrities? How did that happen?
Well, I did quite a bit of television with the first book. And I always really wanted to be on the Merv Griffin show. And it was a good arena for me because I made predictions about the world and famous people and so forth that were absolutely true. And when I'd come back after the first one show, I'd come back and the next show and Merv would say, now tell us which of your predictions came true. Well, there were a large percentage that came true, and he said to me that I was the only astrologer, psychic, what have you, that was ever on his show that ever told him anything about himself that actually happened.
Let's you mentioned another word there. You have astrologer and then you have psychic. Do you consider yourself a psychic as well?
No, I'm not psychic at all. I mean, I can, anything I tell someone, I can show them exactly what I said, you know, what I based it on. I'm not the least bit psychic.
All right, let's skip to today, and this is in 2002, and we had a very traumatic event on 9/11/2001. Just asking from Joan Quigley's point of view, did you foresee that? Did you see that type of trauma?
I spoke to the UN journalists on January 14th of 1998, and every prediction I made happened, and one of them was that the East Coast would be attacked by terrorists, and someone thought it was so funny that they put it was either in January of the next year in Newsweek or U.S. News and World Report, I forget which one it was, but they put it in the People column. They thought it was so funny.
Did you pick the actual month and year and day?
No, I didn't. I think the reason I didn't was because I could see times that this was unfolding, and I saw the times. But after it happened, I looked through all my charts, the possibilities of charts I could have done, and I got it to the day.
Do you believe,
one particular chart.
Now this is just, and I know that you have a very inquisitive mind, and you probably, we're going to do some very big guesstimating here, but do you think that Osama bin Laden is still alive?
Well, it's hard to say because I've got 3 different dates for his birth, and I don't think I think this is none of them. I think I have the day probably that he was born, but it's so hard, you know, to pick a day. He was 12 years old when his father died, and his approximate age is known. It's very hard to pick any day all year, But from his appearance and everything, I have picked a day, and I think the eclipse in December will bring out something about him on that day.
So you think we'll have some
Or
definitive answer?
in that 2-week period after the eclipse.
Yeah.
And of course, it's an eclipse in Sagittarius.
Interesting. Let me ask you this much. We are in a new cyber age. Obviously, you've caught on to that, and now you're attempting to do something much different than all of your celebrity has taken you from, and now you're trying to do something on the internet. What's your? I better ask you first before I forget. What's your website address?
JoanQuigley.net.
And tell us, if you will, what is this? What are you trying to accomplish?
I'm trying to bring astrology back to its lost respectability, because my website tells a lot about astrology. It tells about what I do. It tells about predictions I've made that have happened, and it tells about books I've written, and it tells about ancient astrology and how Stonehenge was one of the primitive observatories for the position of the sun, and it tells about my time in Egypt. I remember being at Luxor at night and going back to Thebes in a horse cart and looking up at the sky and seeing so many stars it was untrue. In San Francisco, you only see a star very occasionally, but in this place, it was like Alabama. The stars were everywhere, and you could see why the ancients in that part of the world were so interested in the stars.
Now, with the state of our world in some flux right now, and what we're going to be, the changes that are foreseen, we're watching transpire in front of our eyes. What do you think that astrology can do to help people better understand what's going on around them in their world?
Well, I think it's very sad what's happening in the world now. I think we're using 19th century solutions to 21st century problems. And I think we have to realize that the world can go two different ways. Technology can absolutely blow the world apart on both sides of the equation, or we can take that technology and make life a heaven for the average person. If we would spend the billions that we spend on war on peaceful, constructive things, I believe we have to deal with the threats that oppose us now. But I think if our objective were to use astrology constructively, we could make this earth an absolute paradise for even the poorest person.
All right, final question to Joan Quigley. I'm going to come back a little bit to those people that would say that astrology is not only a pseudoscience, not only an iffy endeavor at best, but they think it's the devil's workshop. Well, let me take some time and just explain to the American people why, or whether you believe that's possible, true, not true, whatever you want to say.
I think as an astrologer, I'm a very constructive person, and I'd like to help people solve their problems. And I'd like to help people appear as they really are inside. And I think I have always wanted to take a constructive attitude toward things. I myself have just been through a period where everything would crash on me, and I knew when I went into it that would happen, but I had an objective, so I lived according to my objective. And when something crashes on me, I just pick myself up and think, what do I do next? And I think that's what people have to do.
Well, listen, Joan Quigley, it's been very kind of you to join us on the cutting edge today. Obviously, this is an issue that has been around for over 3,000 years, and so obviously we can't say it's just going to go away over tomorrow. So we would certainly want to say thank you so much for representing the astrology community, and we wish you well in all that you do. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Cutting Edge.